what can we associate with early music? Depending on the definition, the term covers relatively large spans of time, usually referring to the medieval, Renaissance and Baroque periods of Western music. How can we know what the music of that time sounded like when performed live, since we obviously have no recordings, only the written scores? Do the musicians of our time have the ability to play it as it was originally performed? The exploration of early music is an intriguing venture. The initial prejudices will inevitably give way to the new, inspiring perspectives of this music, which was written some 300 or 400 years ago. I had the pleasant opportunity of speaking to the early music ensemble Harmonia Antiqua Labacensis and of listening to their rehearsal for the festival Radovljica, the oldest festival of early music in Slovenia. Please join me on the journey through the many beauties of early music.
Why revive old music when contemporary music abounds? Well, the music might have been written ages ago, but it carries a message that remains valuable throughout the course of time. The scores are old, but not the music itself. Today's performances of early music are inspiring, a delight to listen to, and paradoxically sound quite new in their own way. First, let us have a look at what the term early music relates to.
When it was first used in the 18th century or so, it meant that the composers are already dead. And this is true for most composers today, for most composers that are played very often in concerts. And I think today it's much more broader. I mean, we have music from the Middle Ages and then Renaissance, and mostly it's Baroque music. But of course, we also have music from the classical period, played on appropriate instruments, that is on instruments for which the music was written for. And also today, even 20th century music is sometimes played on period instruments, so it somehow gets into the same field, and you could say that's early music as well.
The idea of early music is to go back to every time. It's not only, in our case, it's Baroque music, but the same applies to Middle Ages, Renaissance, etc. Now the movement goes back also, or goes forth to Haydn, classical, romantic, even to Wagner. The idea behind is that if we try to go to these roots, what the composers intended to do, what the audience expected to listen, then we are able, it might sound as a paradox, but we might be able to make a more contemporary message, since it allows us to understand what we are supposed to say.
I mean, early music is not a homogeneous thing. We have, of course, it has sacred music, church music, and also other music like for banquets, or also there was folk music. We don't know how it sounded, but of course there was much more music that was improvised and so on. And so we shouldn't take early music as something that exists. It's just an idea we have when we think about early music. I don't know, I mean, Perhaps it's not always liturgical music, but that it was sometimes sung at private devotion, so not only at Mass, but also in the chamber.
How does early music differ from classical, contemporary or romantic music in terms of style and performance? What does it have to offer to the musicians and the audiences from a subjective standpoint?
I think as a singer, the music from the Baroque period is more instrumental and more virtuosic, and paints the text in a different way with lots of color, with ornamentation. And nowadays music is much more monosyllabic. It paints each individual word and it has less chance for virtuosity.
Maybe it's the first time in history that it is like that we can hear music of all different periods, because former they always just wanted to hear new music. Yeah, music which was written 15 years ago was already old, and we are playing music which is 400 years old. So that's, I think, a very new matter of fact. And the difficulty, if we try to play it in a manner how it was played before, is that we always have to change language. So, for example, if I just look at the 18th century, I have a different language every 10 or 20 years. And we never will get it like a mother language, because it's always learned. That's the difficulty about that.
The difference between playing classical music and old music for me is that in classical music it's a lot more, I should say, intense, but I mean it in a very good way, because when I play old music then I suddenly feel this peace inside, you know, there is a lot less vibrato or almost no vibrato, and I mean it's very intense music, of course, in its own way, but really different than the classical perception. So I always like to do it because it always sort of puts me down to earth as a musician. So I start to think differently and also feel differently, and as a result of that I also play differently, and it's a magnificent feeling.
Basically, the difference between Baroque music and the other kind of music is that I feel that I can express all my feelings. In fact, I have more freedom to express this, and maybe I know that there are another kind of music, of styles, that you can do it also, but for me I feel more comfortable with this music.
what the quality is, it's just a very different way of writing music and also a different way of playing this music then. And the music we play in this concert is really from the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, where big change was in composing music. Before it was quite polyphonic and vocal music, and then it starts being even instrumental. And this is very interesting on this program to focus on that, how it changed, or how the values change from vocal to instrumental music. That I like a lot on this kind of stuff we play now.
19th century music, a big romantic era, has a totally different aesthetic than what we got after the Second World War, due to big difference in the society also. Also, we live totally different than in the 19th century. So already music from the 19th century, which is not so old, it's only 100 years old, but already we play it in the wrong way. We don't play it as it was meant to be played. It's, for instance, all the beginnings of notes, all the stresses. Right now we play quite firm, a lot of accents, a lot of stress on the first. We know when we listen to old recordings, there are already some early recordings from the 19th century. Virtually every tone starts in a small crescendo. They start like, it's never like puff. And now, for the last 50 years, the most important thing is beat and the accent. So it is the music, the way the contemporary orchestras play it is probably just totally wrong. It's not. It's just not as it was supposed to be played.
With Baroque music, the challenge is, in a way, it's more fun. I think as a singer, you have to change the way that you produce your voice depending on the obligato instruments that you are singing with. So you have to be more of a chameleon. When you're singing 20th century music, there's always the challenges of pitching music, and the music is more difficult in a way to get inside, in a way that I think people have become more complex to understand. And I think you get the complexities of the person, of the composer in the music in a way that you don't with Baroque music.
From, let's say, 18th century and before, there are not so many like important schools, you know. We have in the 19th century music and 20th century music, we have, for instance, Russian piano school. So you have to get into this, you have to know everything about this, you have to have a certain style, but then probably you just play the music, you rehearse it after the methods that they write about, you know, just use the methods that they are using. For the 18th century music, obviously we don't have their methods, we only have their school books. We have the books that they wrote how to play this music. So obviously it probably needs more of intellectual work, not just technical work, just in order to get the right style, you know, and to see what needs to be practiced, because the music itself is just notes.
Baroque music was created 300 years ago. There are no recordings of how the music was originally played. Some manuscripts and music scores remain, of course. But how important is the overall knowledge of the era, its lifestyle, society and culture for historically informed performance?
Early music is a broad term, so we have recordings from 100 years ago, and they are already much different from the style we are playing, most people are playing in now. So we see that the style has changed a lot. Things that appeal to us today are not the same that appealed to the people 100 years ago, and probably we will never be able to realize everything and to say, so this is how they sounded. It's much more that we use some ideas. We read, sometimes we can read about them in text like manuals about how to play an instrument or what the music was like if somebody described a performance or something. And then of course we have old instruments and also paintings. We can reconstruct this instrument and then learn a lot from the instruments. And of course we have the most important thing is the music. So we can look at the music. Sometimes it's, for example, it's very interesting to look at different versions of one piece to see what was important to a composer and what was not. And if he worked on a piece later, then what he changed after the first version. So we can perhaps see what was the important thing, or we can analyze the music, of course, but that's the problem. We don't know how much they analyzed in the past. Although I have to say that most musicians back then, they had to compose. They were not only instrumentalists, but they were also composers. So I think they knew a lot about this music. I mean, they knew how it was put together.
Well, I mean, of course, nowadays you have access to so much information. So we in a way, performing Baroque music now compared to even 60 years ago, we have so much more knowledge than we did then. And of course it's interesting, but I don't necessarily know if it influences you. It can affect your performance, but it doesn't influence your performance, because I think the music of the Baroque period is so strong as music. But then I suppose one could argue that with our modern ears and the fact that we've gone through the Romantic period and we've gone through the 20th century period of music, that you hark back to it, so you will never ever have a true feeling of the freshness that they had when this music was being written. In the same way with architecture, you know, you can imagine when these huge, massive cathedrals were being built, how thrilling this was, but for us, we're used to it. You're almost disappointed if you go to a city and there's not an amazing, impressive cathedral to look at. So it's very hard to go back in time and to imagine how you would change your interpretation, I think.
I think it's quite important to know how people lived in these times, and especially these people who heard this music, because they have not been the common people, but the people next to the king. And they surely had a very different way of life and a different side of life. For example, if somebody writes, you should play it very fast, then I think for us maybe very fast is something completely different, because maybe we are moving much faster than they moved 300 years ago, because we are also used to move, for example, in train with 300 kilometers per hour, and they surely weren't used to move faster than, I don't know, 30 kilometers an hour. So that's a thing which really changed a lot. And a lot of attitudes, beliefs, or whatever are very different nowadays. And I think for understanding the music, it helps a lot if we know how people have been thinking in these times.
Every music, and also, for instance, this is the most bizarre example, also the work of the avant-garde of the 60s is right now already not, it's so far away that we don't have the right feeling for it. So we have to do also at the avant-garde music from the 60s, we have to read articles about it, we have to listen to early recordings, because the music sounds totally different as what we would do by intuition right now. So it's not just Baroque music, it's every music should be done in a historically informed way. So it should be done after reading, listening to examples if they are, reading all the sources, and there should be a way developed to play this music it was meant to be, not to take it too easy, you know.
Sometimes we say in our world that if somebody knows too much, then it's difficult to play because you cannot realize everything you want or you know about the era. I think it's very important. I mean, it's important to have some stylistic knowledge about the era. You know, if you look at old paintings, then you see how much work they put in that, and you know, and you look at modern paintings, and it's much more about oneself and about the idea. It's the act of creation is another one, and I think I mean, if we compare, for example, with music with painting, then we could say that probably the musicians were much more precise, much more concerned with detail, and probably they even had much more time to work on the music.
Well, in which case we have no record of how what the quality of performance was in those days. So I suppose you're always, as an individual, aspiring to be better and better every time you perform, and so you try to keep as close to the music as you can, and you look to the music for the inspiration. And as a performer, you always, I think, always try to better your performance.
In my opinion, what is important is not so much the way it was done, but what the music was supposed to, the effect it would have on the audience, and the message or the effect it would have on audience, and that's what we should try to achieve today with today's audience, to produce the same feelings, the same impressions than composers or music did at that time. And for that, every information is useful, not only the score.
instruments were different as well. What are the challenges for today's musicians when playing them?
Yes, that's the nice thing about early music, because you know that sometimes modern composers, they write for prepared piano, they change the piano in some way, and we don't have to do that. I mean, we have new sounds with these instruments which weren't used for centuries, and then now we are starting to use them or start reconstructing them, and we get another sound which is somehow new for our ears at least, and that's a very interesting thing.
Using period instruments, which means they are built like they have been in these times. The stringed instrument didn't change so much than, for example, wind instruments. You can really see it on the wind instruments, but also here is quite a big change. For example, on this viola, it's a tenor violin, pretore is called, and it's quite bigger than the violas which are used then in the classical music. So it's really thick, and it has a much stronger sound because it's bigger. And they were really used in these times because it was the people were thinking more in concerts, so in family of instruments. And in the classical music it changes a bit. And in this polyphonic music also the lower parts are quite important, or much more important. And later on it changes to be more one or two high voices and the bass line, and then we are really in the Baroque period. And therefore, for example, these instruments really change, but also the violins are built a bit different with gut strings, and also the bows are very different. It looks very, very different to a modern bow, and yeah, therefore there's a big difference for us to play. And also the techniques, for example, with this bow, I play it with the undergrip. So really the thumb on the hair, not like that, which then changes in the 17th century already. And I also try not to keep the viola really with the head, because here I disturb a bit of the sound. So the sound cannot really develop if I have it stuck here. Small changes of techniques.
Interesting part about these instruments is that, of course, we don't know if we would like the sound of the instruments back then, but of course, on the other hand, most instruments, most violins that are used today by well-known soloists are made in the 17th or 18th century. So the instruments were obviously very good. They were the best instruments that ever existed, I mean, concerning violins.
For me, that I am a violin player, it's very important the bow, the way to play, the difference that you can choose. You can play the different ways you can play with this bow, which is lighter.
Also, today we use different techniques, but back then the technique was even more different from city to city, or at least from country to country. Players used different, for example, bow grips, how they take the bow, and of course also the pitch was much different. Today we have almost all the classical music is in the same pitch. I mean, the modern orchestras, they all play in 4/43, and back then, for example, in Italy there were many different pitches in the range of a minor third, for example, and that's very important to know, because we have singers, then we have to know at which pitch the music was sung, so the singer can, for example, if it's a very low tessitura, then we can think, okay, perhaps it was very, very high, but we have to think about that. We don't just take a certain pitch and do the music at that pitch, and it doesn't really work very well. And then, but we have to find some material about how the pitch was and so on.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come far on our journey through the beauties of early music, but there is still a lot to get to know. You are kindly invited to join us for the next part of the show, where the musicians of the Harmonia Antiqua Labacensis Ensemble will be sharing their views on the importance of interpretation.
Seven.